Okay, so we're recording. Good morning, Brian. Good morning, Bill.
Good morning, Hayley. Hi, Bill. It's great to finally see your face. Hayley, Bill and I met formally through Facebook and started exchanging information, and I was shocked at how parallel our lives were with Bill out on the West Coast and me on the East. But boy, thing after thing that Bill sent me to read, I thought, yikes, wouldn't it, I wrote to him, wouldn't it have been cool if we had walkie-talkies when we were in high school or even cans with a string so that we could have talked about, our fascination with Robert Conrad when he took his shirt off in Wild Wild West. Hayley, you're not going to relate to that at all. You probably don't know who Robert Conrad is or even what the television show was, but
I'm aware of the history of it. I've never watched a single episode of it, so I'm going to let you enjoy that moment, and I'll bask in your glory.
Well, we'll probably touch on it, but Bill is writing a book. I don't know how close to being published you are, Bill, but it's a really it's an important, really important for me and others like me to read. It's a spiritual autobiography of a gay man born 1948, the same as me, and the journey that he made. And the great thing about the book is that it's exactly what we talk about on this podcast. So, Bill, thank you for coming. The title of your book is "I'm Here Looking for a."
I came here looking for a person.
I came here looking for a person.
And spirit-flecked journey.
Say it again.
The a spirit-flecked journey is the full title.
Spirit flex.
Flecked, F-L-E-C-K-E-D, a spirit flecked.
Oh, spiritual flex. Oh, flex. Yeah.
Not controlled, but just
yeah. And the title comes from Thomas Merton.
The title comes from Thomas Merton. The first half of the title, I came here seeking a person, and I adapted it to suggest that the life journey is we seek a person, but we really seek three persons. We seek ourselves, trying to find out who we are and how we are. We seek the other, you, our beloved, our friends, human beings, and finally we seek the divine you or the divine other. Who is replicated in some way in both ourselves and in those we come to love in this life.
Bill, do you think you can have a relationship with the divine without having a relationship with the other?
I couldn't imagine how that would be constructed by the psyche. The other, you, the people we meet and the people we grow to love are really the mirrors for the divine, and they're the way we have access to the divine. Not the only way, but a primary way, a primitive way, an essential way, and they open up the portal towards the ineffable. I think, at least that would certainly be my case.
Bill, when and how did you become aware of this concept of I'm seeking you or I'm seeking a person?
Well, before I knew those words from Thomas Merton, who is really my great teacher in life, I would say I was aware of that when I was a little boy. That my earliest intimations of the divine were manifest when I was about 4 or 5 years old. Really before I had any education or before the massive church took over my brain, which it did for several decades, and not regrettably, but powerfully and influential. But as a little boy, I was aware of a presence that I have been aware of my whole life. And it's probably the word that approximates the divine the most for me is the word presence. I'll capitalize it, but there is a presence, and I think we're aware of it, especially in particular moments in our life. It can be cultivated.
Bill spent many years as a Jesuit priest. For those of you unfamiliar with Jesuit, it's a Society of Jesus. It's a religious community within the Roman Catholic faith. But Bill was a principal. He was an educator. And he moved from that into heading up a major response to people with AIDS. And I'm really eager to hear about how you felt that call, Bill, and how you and the journey to respond to it.
Thank you, Brian, for asking that. I first heard the word GRID, which is the predecessor of AIDS, gay-related immunodeficiency disorder. In early 1982, I had just met my then boyfriend, now husband, and we were reading a gay rag, The Advocate, and there was a little story about doctors in Los Angeles who had found a cluster of gay men who had this rare cancer that they typically associated with men in the Mediterranean basin. Our first friend came down with AIDS not so long after that. It moved, the virus was in San Francisco, of course, and had been, but it manifested very quickly. And we had a friend who was diagnosed on a Tuesday and he was dead on Sunday, as that happened in the early days of the epidemic. And when our very close friend Randy was diagnosed, and first close friend, it affected me deeply. And part of my training as a Jesuit and part of the way I was raised in my family was to be of service. And I knew I wanted to do something to respond to this man and soon many of our friends. So I volunteered ultimately at the San Francisco AIDS Foundation and was asked to be a board member forthwith, partially because I had experience in management, and I had just recently finished a degree in clinical psychology. So I brought some things to the table that they thought would be of value. And I was on that board for many, many years and led that board for kind of 3 critical years, 88 through 91 of the epidemic, when, as Brian knows, it was at its raging peak. And I lost many, many friends during that decade. In some ways, my whole cohort of friends that I had met at Dignity, of which Brian is very familiar, when I was late in my life as a Jesuit. Of that group of friends I met at Dignity, with whom I celebrated my 30th birthday, all but one died within 10 years, most within 5 years. In 1989, the last of those men, Franciscan priest Larry Tozio, died. So the AIDS epidemic took over my life for 15 years, and I worked in it full time. I eventually ran a healthcare agency in the Tenderloin neighborhood of San Francisco, which took care not only of gay men, but a lot of Black men and women who had acquired AIDS through different means than gay men had. So we formed a real community, and I led that agency for 7 years.
Go ahead, Hayley.
I was gonna ask, there was the height, what we consider the height of AIDS, and now Corona is. Are you still involved in AIDS, and how do you see AIDS sort of evolving to where it is now, and the support that's available for people with AIDS now?
So I recently retired after 35 years as a clinical psychologist, and I had clients up until the end of my practice who had HIV disease. So I was involved in AIDS in one way or another from 1983 to, what is 3 years ago, 2018. Of course, once the cocktail became available in the late 90s, in 1996, it changed the face of AIDS in the United States forever, because men who had previously had a death sentence now had an opportunity through the miracle of drugs. And I give Dr. Fauci, who's of course an enormous figure in our culture at this moment, he was an enormously important figure in the AIDS epidemic, as Brian well knows. He led NIH, and he was the one who advocated strongly, even when he was opposed by some gay men, to move forward as fast as possible, but within the strictures of science, to develop responses to the virus. And they succeeded in 1996. Many people were involved in that. The French were very involved in that. So AIDS in the United States became a very manageable disease like diabetes, and we still have close friends who were in their 20s and now they're in their 50s who are living full lives with HIV disease and totally managed lives. In the rest of the world, not so good. In Africa in particular, and in India, AIDS in many countries is still a death sentence.
Bill, with using the model of the hero's journey, filling the call, and do you feel that there are more than one in each of our lives? There's more than one hero's journey
that each of us partake in?
That one might say that my call was to come out and be a face and spokesperson on gay issues for my life. That was my calling. And when Hayley and I first started talking, I shared with her that I affirm and am grateful for that, but I don't feel that's my last journey, that I'm feeling called to do something more. I haven't discerned exactly what that is, but I feel as if my service isn't over.
I would certainly affirm that your service is not over, Brian. Okay. And Hayley, I want to cop on myself about Brian. When I was a Jesuit in the 1970s, totally closeted and pretty inebriated, Brian had a profile in the United States as I thought, very young, out gay man, almost unheard of in the early mid 70s. And he got a lot of press in progressive Catholic media, which I was a consumer of. And I saw this young man in Detroit. And of course, I thought he was so handsome, I couldn't hardly look at the articles. And he is. But he really touched the lives. He will never know how many lives he touched, because he touched my life. And Brian's been in my psyche for almost 50 years. And we're not that old yet to have 50 years in each other's psyche, but he was in my psyche as a model of what it meant to have to live your own life, to meet yourself, as the title of my book suggests, to meet yourself and claim yourself on life's terms. And Brian had done that with an enormous amount of courage when the landscape was significantly different than it is now. He ran up against tidal winds that were formidable, and here he is. So we do have different stages in our hero's journey. And I think we're not done until we take our last breath. Writing this book for me, which I resisted for 20 years, and I deeply resisted it after having many intimations to be doing this, was a significant chapter for me. And it was very clear now that I finished the book and it's out seeking publishers.
Oh, good.
This was a vocation for me. This was what I was called to do. And I love your very Catholic use of that word call. It's like the call is significant. I hope this is one of my last chapters, because I'm getting tired, but
yeah, no.
I love my garden, and I happen to be in great health, so I'm optimistic, but we don't know. I didn't, when I retired 3 years ago, I had no idea I would do this book, but I also knew I had to retire to do it. It was going to take it out of me. So good question about the hero's journey.
I think that the hero's journey gets easier. I think the beginning phases of it, when we first sort of make that commitment to embark on our journey, to be aware of our purpose, and then to take those steps onto that path, are the most difficult. And what we face at that point is the most difficult. And I think it gets easier as it goes on from there, because you're collecting the tools, you're also collecting more and more wisdom along the way. So I mentioned to Brian a lot of the time that, yeah, he's definitely entering another phase, but it is going to be different, because it is going to be more ease, more grace, more joy.
Yeah, Hayley, on the other side of that, if I might, when I was younger, I didn't have as much to lose. I wasn't aware of having as much to lose. I came out at age 26, and I didn't have anything. I loved, the image of Francis of Assisi not having anything. And so I think it can get harder as you get older, because you accumulate more things, like a reputation and material things, and a comfort with material things, and a partner. I left this priest partner of mine just prior to coming out. And so there was no one really except my family impacted by all of what I was doing. But if I decided today to go on a hunger fast, let's say, it impacts Ray, and Lincoln, the dog. And so I think it can go both ways. I think when you're young, you've got energy and you're so idealistic and romantic that can give you the energy to, charge out and make it. But the other side of it is that you don't have as much that you're aware of at the time to lose. I mean, you do lose professional options, but I wasn't so aware of that at the time.
What do you think, Bill? And how has your journey been? Do you think it was harder in the beginning, or was there a middle point that was harder?
I kind of do these check-ins with myself at the decadal years. So when I was 40, I knew I had enormous work to do. It was in the middle of the epidemic. I had just been elected president of the AIDS Foundation, and I felt really on fire. I felt very internally strong, but I had my stuff. I still have my stuff, by the way. When I was 50, I went back to school and finished a degree in divinity that I had started as a Jesuit 25 years earlier. And I looked to doing more specific ministry because during the AIDS epidemic, I had begun to do a lot of what Brian would recognize as specific Catholic sacramental work with men dying of AIDS, especially burying men. And then I was asked to start marrying people, and it got very complicated for me. So I went back to school to qualify myself, thinking I would spend the rest of my life doing that, and I did not. I could not see the horizon yet at 50. When I turned 60, I could see the horizon. It was like, oh, this is a limited engagement you have, Bill. It's not going to be a long-running show. You may have 20 years left, you may have 30, you may have 2. But the crises I went through in my life, which I wrote about in the book at length later in the book, I don't think, Brian may have had one of those chapters, hit me in my 60s. And I went through a several-year period of great darkness and profound doubt, lack of trust in myself, and alienation from the divine. And I would never have thought that I needed to go through it. Now, in retrospect, I came to know that. And part of it is because my hero's journey had been so successful, my ego had become a little occluded, and myself, my soul, my psyche was like, oh, brother, you are buying your program, and it is just not a program worth your money. And I went through a very dark time. It was vital that I do that. It prepared me for what I'm now living the rest of my life. So when I turned 70 a couple of years ago, I thought, okay, you have no plans. You're in charge of nothing. You are in charge of, you think you're in charge, you are in charge of nothing. And in that way, it's simpler because I know that to be true in a fundamental way. My ego doesn't like that. My ego thinks I'm in charge of quite a bit, but Brian and I are the exact same age, so I know he knows some of what I speak. Life has a plan for us. The Lord has a plan for us. Presence has a plan that we either flow with or we obstruct. And I've done both, Hayley. I've done both. Good question.
Bill, what do you think happens after you die?
To be honest, I don't give it thought. I don't have a belief system that includes an afterlife. That there is a second life or another life or a chain of lives is plausible to me, but it's not part of the economy of my spirituality, and does not affect, at least consciously, the way I live my life. The last chapter of the book is about my relationship with Jesus, a word that is complicated in our culture. I don't understand Jesus as a divine entity. I really see him as a Alan Watts, the kind of Episcopal Buddhist mystic, said Jesus had an overwhelming experience of cosmic consciousness. And to me, that captures it perfectly. And that's the person I'm drawn to. We can have experiences of cosmic consciousness. That doesn't mean we're divine. It doesn't matter if he's divine or not to me. It's not a compelling question, but what he is for me is an absolute model of how to live my life, including being willing to accept profound suffering. Not necessarily as redemptive, but as cohesive, as being an essential part of what it means to be a human being. And if we're not suffering at all in this world, I'd say we need to get out of our houses and start doing a little suffering, because the world needs the tenderness that comes from suffering. So,
well, that leads to a question that Hayley and I have been asking different guests is, what is wisdom and what is its source?
oh, Brian, that's a hard question. What's your next question? No, I'll play for a second. I'm going to repeat myself a little bit. I think the source of a lot of wisdom is suffering. Our willingness to go through our travails, which are many and each unique in our lives, and cleave to the deepest intuitions we have about who we are and what is possible and who's in charge. And to me, the universe is in charge. The creator of the universe has a design that I am working to be part of and be open to. Wisdom comes, if I have wisdom, and I don't claim to have wisdom, I have a lot of experience, but if I have wisdom, it comes from having been faithful to the work of becoming myself. That's the goal of my life, is to become
That's a great
myself.
definition.
Thank you.
Say it again.
Well, wisdom, it comes from the act or the art of becoming myself, which I think is the primary human task, is for each of us to become ourselves. And if we do that, we will stay true, we will stay open, we will stay in love. And it's hard to be ourselves. The culture invites us to be anything but, and I love the culture and I love all of its adaptations. And I've fallen for many of them over the years. Right this morning, I'm not falling for too many, so you caught me at a good moment.
But do you not see yourself as a wise child? I mean, you talked about being 4 or 5 and having an awareness of the divine. And, you know, we say that some children have old souls, and we're really basically trying to say that there's a wisdom there that doesn't reflect their age. I have this image of so many gay boys, little boys, you know, who felt different from the rest of the group. Having some, I mean, that's why you and I, you know, I've so identified having an awareness as a child that I had this special relationship with God. Not that I didn't want anyone else to have it, but that I had it and there was no denying it. Well, where does that come from?
Boy, I wish I had a quick and clean answer to that question. I identify with it. I knew as a 4-year-old that there was something going on for me I regarded as a gift. I did nothing to earn it or to deserve it. I still did nothing to earn or deserve all the gifts I've been given. I think gifts are given for a purpose, as you know, because your life has been exemplary and your life has been instructive for other people how to become themselves. You were doing that to me in the 70s. You didn't know that, but I was in Milwaukee and then out in San Francisco, struggling to become myself. And here was this man teaching me from afar. So where does it come from? It's a gift. I believe we're all given gifts. So I don't want to say that I'm special. Having been a therapist to hundreds of people, everyone who came in my office, I learned to see their gifts, and their gifts were, they didn't see their gifts. And I came to a therapist to have the gifts slowly disclosed by them to themselves, by another human being being present to them, which to me is therapy. Where do they come from? They come from the one who gives gifts. They come from the divine. They come from the cosmos. They come from presence. They come from that which is really too deep for us to articulate fully, but which we know intuitively and we trust deeply. How odd is that for human beings? But here we are, three trusters.
Complete. I over the last week, humility has been a very big word for me, as well as in my sessions with clients. How has humility been important in your hero's journey, and when you start thinking about suffering?
You don't have easy questions, Hayley, do you? You go right for the jugular.
This is just where my head is, so
So I
let me
think,
give you some background.
I think humility is I don't know your background, of course, deeply, but humility is the most critical virtue. It's the most critical virtue because our egos are voracious. I'll speak for myself. My ego is voracious, and I've tried a lot of what the voraciousness was directed towards. Humility, which is when we fall to our knees, whether as religious people or not. I ended up on my knees. I've been in recovery for 42 years, but as an active alcoholic, I was on my knees a lot. I wasn't corresponding to the grace being offered me for many years, but it took humility for me to finally acknowledge I need help. And during the course of my sober life, which is my adult life, required of myself that I acknowledge that I'm not in charge, which is a form of humility, has been essential to my continued growth. I was asked to exercise power and authority many times in my life, and those are delicious and deceptive at the same time. And we could buy into our own resume, and and go, oh, you're something, and there's a lie that we're something. It's not that we're not powerful, smart, adaptable, caring human beings, but the deepest truth is the rector of Grace Cathedral, which is the big Episcopal cathedral in San Francisco, Alan Jones, who's written many books on spirituality, said once during a homily a phrase I have memorized for 30 years, and it's, "We are not standing on our own, we are only being held up." When he said that, it was like this revelation for me. We are not standing on our own, Bill Glenn, whoever you think you are only being held up by forces you cannot see, that you will never know about. And that is why you get to do what you do. You don't have a lot to do with this, actually, Bill. Even though you think you do, that's your pathetic ego trying to claw its way back. So I appreciate that word deeply. It's a word I work with a lot in my life. And it's a chastising word in the best sense. It recalls me to the human path.
In an earlier conversation, Hayley and I was talking about the gifts of the Holy Spirit, and which I think are relevant except for fear of the Lord. And we talked about piety. What's the meaning of piety? And we sort of concurred that it is about humility, that that a gift of the divine is the awareness that you're being used if you're open to being used. You know, I like myself, I'm sure from your earliest days, Bill, that you knew the prayer of Francis of Assisi, whether he wrote it or not, and that his request was paramount in my life. Before every speech, I would always say the prayer of Francis and say, use this time, use it. I'm here. I grew up, we had a record when I was young, and I don't know where this song came from, but the song was, "You're nothing but a nuttin', you're nothing but a nuttin', you're nothing but a nuttin', you're not a thing at all." And that's a message that you can get as a Catholic kid. It wasn't a Catholic song. I don't know where whoever got it, but it was played in our house. And I think that the ego, really can be the mountain that we have to climb in order to see beyond. but it also can help us as long as we don't give it the reins, of the charging horses, that we are something. I mean, I've gotten into my life where I talk about angels. Bill, I would argue that Jesus was divine, but no more than you. That all of us are divine, and that some of us, through whatever circumstance, a previous life, a mission, sent by, quote, our father, our mother, whatever, and that the reason some of us really resonate with each other is that we're vibrating, if you use that word, it's a kind of an inward, we're vibrating at the same level of our divine journey. Does that ring true to you at all, or?
Very true. And I would never argue that Jesus wasn't divine. What I try to say is the things I don't know, I don't claim. So it's kind of an epistemological problem for me.
Yeah.
But I agree with you totally that, and I've learned this from Carl Jung more than from anyone, the divine is within us. It's totally within us. And the self, Jung capitalized the word self, but it was his word for God, was capitalized self. And as I become myself, I would not be so arrogant to say I'm becoming God. That isn't how I understand the journey. I believe I'm being reincorporated into the creator or the divine that created me.
That very much resonates with my belief and my understanding of it, is that, we are not the creator, but we are of the creator. And that journey is coming back into that energy of the creator. And, humility is so important there, because there is humility in managing our ego, and humility in being able to accept that the ego is part of us, if we can use it now in the way that it was intended for. It is our world.
I want to add a comment on ego, because I didn't mean to dismiss its value. We wouldn't be in this conversation without our egos. I couldn't have gotten to bed this morning. My ego is essential. And I have a big ego, and my ego has helped me achieve the things that I have been able to do in my life. And I have to be on guard for it, because it's so essential. It says, no, I'm not just essential, honey. I'm the divine. I go, really? Is that how? And there are some years where I was like, really? Okay. And it turned out the ego was not being honest with me. It was like an agenda. So the ego is, I told this to clients for years. I said, your ego is essential. You're not going to get rid of it, and you have to befriend it. And as you befriend it, it takes its rightful place in kind of the architecture of the person, which includes Freud offered us this architecture, and I pretty much think there's wisdom in it. Many problems with Freud, I'm not denying that, but we have a self, and we have the ego, and we have a super ego. I have as an Irish Catholic, Brian, you and I have super egos. They're like, that's a perfectly named thing, the super ego. And then we have the soul, and the soul is unfazed by the machinations of the ego. And as the ego is put in its proper place, the soul, and this may be what you were alluding to earlier, Hayley, when you talked about it becoming easier, the soul becomes manifest. And the soul, we begin to recognize the soul is the heart of the journey, and it's the journey, and it's within us. It's a wonderful architecture once the ego is housed correctly within it.
I think it's really an important conversation, because so often what I find myself breaking down, it sounds like you had similar experiences too, is people hearing the ego is so bad, you've got to learn how to just dismiss it, discipline it. And that doesn't really work. And it sort of is similar to what I'm seeing now, where everybody is like, we have to dismantle the patriarchy. We need to have the rise of the divine feminine. It's almost the same thing. We're still in this pattern of dismissing, disciplining, rather than befriending.
A perfect distinction.
Bill, what sent you into your dark period?
I had 3 events that happened clustered together. I had been asked to become the senior vice president for development of a major foundation. And I have had a relatively humble income being a teacher and a therapist. The income in this position was like, okay, it was out of control. And I was offered this job. And I told the head of the foundation, who had known my work, I said, I really see my work in the world to be a small p priest. And she said, that's what we need here. We need your priest. And I was so honored by that she could see that. So I took this job. It was a nightmare of profound proportions. I tried to leave after a week. It was so clear to me what a profoundly dysfunctional place. And she asked me to stay and help her correct it. And that appealed to my caretaking. Oh, of course I'll help you do that. It took me, I left after 2 years, and that was a big defeat for me. It wasn't a defeat at all in life, but it was a big defeat for my ego. During the height of the epidemic, many people who had seen me perform funerals and then weddings asked if we could start praying together. And after many years of being asked, I started a group. We called it Spirit Group. And I put out an email to anyone who would ask me to do anything specifically sacramental in their lives. And 45 people showed up at our house. And we did this work for 7 years, every other Sunday for 7 years. Very powerful work. But as happens with what are called house churches, their shelf life is about 3 years. So we were going strong at 7, but then internal battles that didn't involve me began to take over as people were struggling for power and authority within the group. And I felt that I needed to leave that. I did not want to be involved in that. That was very hard for me. And then my best friend was a man who had some, let's say, exigencies in his life. And he asked me, he knew I could see him deeply. And he had known that for years. And he asked me to tell him what I saw. And I said, that's not for me to do. And he really begged. And so at a certain point in time, I decided to tell him what I saw, which was an enormous shadow side of him that he was not willing to look at. The day I told him, he left my life. So I had these 3 events occur. He left my life for 7 years. We repaired our friendship, and now we are once again lovely friends. But these 3 events occurred, and I didn't recognize them as having the effect on me. But Brian, I was in my garden one Saturday morning, shortly after this man left my life. And I had the sense I didn't want to live anymore. I have a robust capacity for life. I love life, and I have a very rich, blessed, full, diverse life. And I was overtaken with this feeling. And it lasted for about 5 years. And
what brought you out of it?
Well, I thought maybe I had had a stroke, actually. I was old enough to have had a stroke, and my doctor said sometimes people have strokes and they manifest in a variety of psychological ways. So I was open to that, and I went to see a neurologist, and a wonderful Irish Catholic guy at the end of his career, and he said, you haven't had a stroke, but something's going on for you, and it's not psychiatric. I think it's spiritual. I'm going, nice talking to you, doctor. I'll find someone else. And it continued, and I had a very close friend who was the pastor of a very large, very progressive church on Northwestern University's campus in Chicago. And I knew him to be, to use your word, a wise man. Again, our age, exactly our age. And I flew to Chicago to see him. His wife, who I love deeply, was away for the weekend. And Robert and I sat up until about 2 a.m. And I told him, I want to come and tell you this journey to see if you have an insight, because I'm suffering. And at about 1 a.m, he went into his library. He's a very erudite guy, and he brought out a copy of Mirabai Starr's translation of Dark Night of the Soul. And I looked at that and I said, oh, I read that in the novitiate. And he goes, well, girl, you're not in the novitiate anymore. Like, well, you. So he said, I think this is what you're experiencing, and the fact you're resistant to this book confirms my hunch. And he said, I want you to, I was going to fly back the next day. He said, I want you to take this with you, and I want you to read this again. It took me a year to read a book that is about that thick. I would read a paragraph and it was almost too much to bear. But I stayed with that task. I can be a very disciplined guy, and when someone smarter than me tells me to do something, I usually do it because I know I'm not at finding these answers. Mm-hmm. And slowly during that year, this lifted from my life. And I regained my equilibrium and my hope, which is such a vital virtue. When I was a young Jesuit, an old Irish priest said to me, the problem with the Irish, Bill, you and me, is we have a lot of faith and we have a lot of charity, but we have no hope. I go, oh, I think I know about that, Father. Thank you. He was right. So I recovered hope. And once I knew I had years later now, I knew I had to go through that period to recalibrate so that my investment in my good works did not determine how I understand myself or the universe to be operating, because all the universe wanted for me was to be me, whether I did these good works or not. And that's almost heresy for an Irish Catholic to say, okay? Mm-hmm. So there I am, the heretic.
Mm-hmm.
Bill, in that period of time, what was the hardest and most beautiful thing?
Where do you get these questions, Hayley?
Your story very much resonates with me. I also, in my career, sort of the beginning of the end was me accepting a job where the money was just like, what? And literally 2 days into the job, I was like, can I go back to where I was? I'd made a massive mistake.
Right.
And that was the beginning of, getting to that point where it was not just a dark night of the soul, it was dark nights of the soul.
Right. The most beautiful thing that occurred to me was a very brief conversation with my husband. I've been with my husband for 40 years. We know each other. When you live with someone, you just know them. Brian, you know this, and Hayley, perhaps you do, I don't know. But he does not interfere in my life at all, and nor I in his. We appreciate, we are two human beings. We love each other. We're together every night. But I said to him, I didn't tell him this. I lived with this for about 1.5 years before I told him. And I said one night, I'm going through a very hard time, and I can't seem to see my way. And he looked at me and he said, you'll know what to do. It was a profound gift to me. Had he tried to tell me what to do, I may have murdered him. I don't know. It could have been gruesome, but he didn't. He's learned the way you talk to Bill is not to tell him what to do, but he just said, you'll know what to do. And it was this great gift to me because he had confidence in me that I didn't have. And he did not suggest how I would find my way through this, but that I would. And I really appreciated that.
You raised a really good question there for me. So when I went through sort of that massive awareness, unwinding, and then coming back to hope, I was on my own. So I had a freedom to just completely fall to my knees and do the ugly cry whenever I felt like it. I just closed the door to my apartment and completely unraveled. You both were in relationships. How do you do this present with another person without bringing them into it? Or just, I'm going to leave it to that original question. How do you do this in the presence of another person?
How do you go through the dark night, or how do you
go through those soul-wrenching moments of unwinding and coming back to hope? And it's not just usually one night, it's a couple, it's a period.
I feel that you're best prepared to do it if you've done some work prior. and the work prior is prioritizing the relationship. You know, if people do not prioritize the relationship, it's not going to be a long-term relationship, or if it's long-term, it's not going to be functioning well. I think if you really want to experience, God at a level unimaginable, you can do it through the love of a significant other, but you have to completely commit yourself to it. And so that means that it takes priority over whatever in your mind is going on in terms of what, you know, you might do. But communication, I mean, we talk about everything. We pick our time, you know, to talk, but we talk about everything. And so, and I'm more likely than Ray is, but I'll say, you know, I'm going through a tough time. You know, I'm having a hard time today. I don't know what it's about, but I'm having a tough time. And he will say, you know, I'm glad you told me about it. You know, is there anything I can do? And that's about as far as it goes, because I know that he's watching me constantly to see our whole 45 years, you know, how can I take care of him? What is it that he needs? You know, is he happy? It's a great question, Hayley, because being in a relationship does change the way you are in the world, positively and negatively in some ways. You know, people will say, I've got a podcast tonight that I want you to listen to at 7:30. Well, that's my time with Ray. And so I'm less likely to do something at night because that's my Ray time. I think Bill can relate to this, but every relationship structures themselves differently. So, you know, if you offered me the job to be executive director of a foundation that was going to pay me $500,000, I wouldn't be able to take it, you know, because it would mean moving my family. And I'm not willing to change the dynamics of my family in order to have that opportunity. Does that at all address your question?
It does, and I would like anything to add to that, Bill, from your perspective.
Not entirely different than I'm a much more intense person than my spouse. Mm-hmm. If he was listening to this right now, he'd go, "You're not kidding, honey. That's the truth." And I'm sure Brian and Ray experienced this. We have learned to receive each other's exigencies and particularities without having to think about it after a long time. Mm-hmm. So Scott knows. He knows more about me than I think he knows. Mm-hmm. And he is always present to that part of me that I don't know that he knows about me, including my intensity. He's not as intense as I am. My friendships are intense. Scott's are like, I go, girl, what? You just go out to lunch? I'm solving the problems of the world, okay? From a psychological, moral, religious, economic, political perspective, all
Jungian, Matonian way.
Totally. And we are complementary in that way. I think if we were both like me, well, we wouldn't be together. There would have been a homicide early on, I'm sure. And if they were both like Scott, they wouldn't have, I know I bring some depth to our relationship. I have a very disciplined spiritual life, and I have had since I met Scott. The first date Scott and I had was, I took him to Dignity, where I was preaching on Mary as an outlaw in 1981. Okay, so Scott's like, oh, this is going to be an interesting ride. Scott's not raised Catholic. He was hardly raised anything. He's 10 years younger than I am. He's a different being in the world, but he receives me perfectly. And by perfectly, I mean in perfect alignment that our time together has taught us. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't say I went through that with Scott. I went through that next to Scott.
Great, yeah.
Would I have gone through it without Scott? Well, I can't determine what my life would be like because I've been with him for more than my life. But each of our calls are unique to us. And I think those of us who choose partners, we choose partners intuitively. I've taught this for years with clients. I say, when we meet the person, our antenna are knowing a lot more than we can know consciously about who we're choosing, because we're choosing someone who has the capacity to be present to us. That there's voracious sex at the beginning is nature's way of gluing us, but it's not the goal. And most people over our age will tell you, yeah, that turned out not to be the goal after all.
Right.
Speaking.
That's some of Harville Hendricks. Is it, Bill, getting the love you want? That we see in other people shadows of our primary caregivers to help us solve some of the unresolved issues of our youth?
Totally.
Yeah.
We marry our deficits in some ways intuitively, and we're smart to do that. And our partners marry their deficits in us, and the complementarity you see, and especially you see really old couples whose tenderness with each other is sublime. Well, they didn't start that way when they were 19.
No.
He was real hungry and she was apparently desirous. So, and here they are with this profound tenderness.
People don't often know what to make of that tenderness when they witness it. One of my books is called "Are You Guys Brothers?" And I'm sure you and Scott have been asked that question. I mean, even if you don't look alike, but people pick up a tenderness they don't know how to define. And the first place they go is biological, that you've got to be related. That's, and we've had it on airplanes. We had it from Vietnamese people asking, you brothers? It's quite wonderful. And it's not something you're even aware of yourself until somebody points it out.
I'll tell you, please, Hayley.
No, carry on, because I have a feeling.
I'll tell you a little tiny story about that. When I brought Scott home for the first time, which was Christmas 1982, the difference between Scott and I is he's gorgeous. Okay, so people don't say, "Are you brothers?" because they're thinking, who's the lame guy with the beauty? But anyway, I brought Scott home. He was 24. I was 34. I had been out of the Jesuits for 2 years. And I had a sister who was very upset that Billy was bringing home a man. The rest of my family is pretty cool, and I'm one of 8 children, but my sister, and she had 2 little girls who were 7 and 5 at the time. And she told my sister told my mother, I'm not sure I want Billy and his boyfriend or his friend around Stacy and Laura. So the night we got home, it was the night of my younger brother's traditional Christmas party at his apartment, and we all went there, and Stacy and Laura were there. And Scott ended up on the floor wrestling with them. It was quite remarkable. 2 days later, Christmas Eve, Lisa, my sister, puts the girls in the bathtub, and the room gets steamed up to get dressed, to bathe before they get dressed to come to Grandma and Grandpa's for Christmas. And about 20 minutes later, Lisa went in to check on her girls. And on the mirror in the bathroom, one of them had gotten out of the tub, and the mirror was steamed over, and they had created a heart with Billy and Scott in the heart.
Oh, wow.
And those girls, they didn't know the word gay from Adam, but they knew, and we did not introduce Scott as, this is Billy, this is Scott, who's our guest for Christmas. Those 2 little girls had told me an enormous amount about life and about homophobia, that homophobia is totally a learned trait, because these 2 girls saw these 2 people who clearly loved each other, and they figured out, oh, they're sweethearts. So I use that story a lot in therapy when gay men would say, oh, I could never come out to my family. I'm going, you'd be surprised what your family can adapt to.
Yeah, don't.
My mother, I go, no mother's ever died as a result of a gay son.
None. And I've never met anyone who regretted coming out.
Brian, neither have I. That's a very wise statement.
Not one. I've never met anyone who said, I wish I hadn't done it.
Right.
That's not to say that they didn't pay a price, but the price didn't match what they gained in the process.
Totally.
And that's a hero's journey.
Yeah.
It is.
We have just 5 minutes, actually 4 minutes left, and I wanted to wrap it up real quick with just one question, which was about tenderness. And for you, Bill, in your book, how would you encourage people to come to tenderness, which I think is like one of the things we need most in the world right now is getting in touch with that tenderness.
I'll answer your question, Hayley, which is a very respectful question, by telling a little story. About 20 years ago, I was running this AIDS agency, and I raised a lot of money, so I gave a lot of talks. And after a talk, a guy came up to me and he introduced himself. His name is Jacques. He's from the Netherlands, and he said, "I think you should come to work at San Quentin with me." And I'm going, what are you talking about? San Quentin is a state penitentiary in California. And I said, I'm fully engaged in my work, and I've never been interested in prison work. And he goes, okay. So I retired from this agency a year later, and this guy, Jacques, who I met once for 5 minutes, calls me. And he said, "Hi, Bill, this is Jacques. Do you remember me?" I said, "I do." And he goes, "Are you ready?" I'm like, "Who are you?" Well, he said, "I want you to come once and just come with me. I see you working in prison with me." So paying attention to synchronicity as I do in my life, I thought, there's something here. You have to at least go to prison once. So I went to prison with Jacques. And within a month, I had become his co-leader of a group of 30 men, all of whom had taken a human life. And I led that group for 10 years. And there's no work I've ever done that was more gratifying and healing for me than being with those men. And the quality of those men that I grew to rely on, and I knew why I went, was their tenderness with one another. These are men who lived in the most abject of circumstances that we create on earth for other human beings. Prison it's mainly chaos. It's noise and chaos. And they lived in total chaos 24/7, total noise for 24/7. And they would come to our group, and they treated each other, almost all Black men, with such tenderness, because they were aware how profoundly they had alienated society and been scapegoated by society from an early age as Black men. And they committed the unspeakable crime. For most murders in the United States, are murders with people who know each other. They lived with profound shame and guilt that could never be expiated in the culture, because the culture had banished them. And they learned intuitively at a very deep level, many of them I think are bodhisattvas, to heal each other of their shame and guilt by treating each other. These are tough, big Black men with tenderness. And I was in this group, and I grew to love these men. And they think they like me a lot, but I have to say, what they did for me was way beyond. And they required of me that I can have a shell, that I be as tender with them as they were with me. I'm the gay guy in the room, right? And I'm supposed to have a monopoly on tenderness. I do shit. Excuse me if this is going public. But their tenderness, I'm still friends with many of them. Many have been released. It was a remarkable period in my life that I could totally not have predicted. And when I went in the first day, once we go through 3 sets of barriers to get inside the yard. The feeling when I got inside the prison yard was, I am home. And I had no idea where that feeling came from. And it turned out to be truer than I could have ever imagined. I wrote a chapter on it in my book that is, to me, one of the most beautiful chapters, because it was about these quite extraordinary men, and it told me everything I really needed to know about us human beings.
What a great way to end.
Yeah. Who's your audience, Bill?
For the book?
Yeah.
You, Hayley, my husband.
Yeah. But you're not self-publishing, so you'll sell more than 4 copies.
The goal of the book, the readership I wrote for, and this is what I resisted for many years, was to encourage human beings, to encourage people to trust profoundly their inner journey and their inner work, to trust their intuitions, those moments when we know something, we see something, we hear something, we're touched by something, to know those are filled with meaning and they are worth attending to. To trust grace, to trust presence. When we come into the presence of a human being that we know there's something about this moment that is for me to learn from, or to grow from, or deepen from. So the goal is to say, trust all of this in yourself. And the book is really filled with 25 experiences where I was required to trust this moment, this event, my own intuition. I've really trusted my intuition throughout my life. but I didn't when I was young. I was taught to do that, and it's been a tremendous gift to me, and it's never steered me wrong, ever. And I think it's we use the word infallible in the Roman Church. I think the real infallible principle in life is our intuition, which some people call the voice of the divine within. But to me, it's been the guidance. So it's to hope to give this to other people so that they see, oh my God, I didn't like Hayley, you did. I didn't experience
so many. I mean,
and, oh, maybe I am okay. Maybe this will turn out okay. Maybe, just maybe, I am good. I'm worthy. Maybe, yeah, maybe that's right. You are worthy, whoever you are.
Yeah, I'm very excited for this book, and I'm sure I'm going to read the introduction probably another 3 more times this week. So deep, but I do want to be conscious of time, gentlemen. So thank you so much for joining us, Bill.
Bill, this is great. My only regret is that we don't live down the street from one another.
Brian, I truly agree, but I'm glad we didn't meet when in the 70s, because I might have fallen in love with you, and then you were too busy, and I would have had a
It'd be different.
Well, we could have done this program together then.
Here we are 50 years later. Well, it's all a grace, and as you know, we meet people when we're supposed to meet them.
Yeah,
Right.
I'm really grateful for that.
I really enjoyed this, and I'm glad to meet you both.
Thanks,
Thank
my
you
friend.
very much.
Thank you.
Have a great week, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.